This is the last mini discussion on communication basics, and then we'll move into perception for the next one. I wanted to start with this picture, which is kind of weird, but it kind of sets up really what I'm talking about today. The idea of in the larger screen, we see a man or a human being running after another human being, look like both men, one wielding a weapon, and yet the camera frames it in such a way that it makes it look like the other person is actually the one that's doing the attacking. And so what I'm talking about today is the concept of framing, which really deals with the context. And so communication always takes place, always takes place in a context. And a definition of the context is simply it's the environment around us that influences both the form and the content of our message, but also influences how we attribute meaning. So the idea of the environment not just being the physical environment. When we think of the environment, we think of like the physical environment. This is a larger definition. And so we're looking today at both how it influences both form and content, how it also influences how we attribute meaning, and really the effect of the context on communication. So we're really looking at when we say context, or when I say context, it's really this is how we can frame things. So there's a couple of dimensions. There's five. The first is what's called the physical dimension. And the physical dimension makes up a couple of different things. It's first off the personal spaces that we have. Now, physical dimension refers to the actual concrete world that we live in. So the rooms in your house all influence how you communicate with other people or how you process information. Outdoor places, like if you're at a park or if you're at a county fair or a state fair, which of course sadly we didn't have this year, or a baseball game, the way you communicate with people is going to be different, and the way you perceive what they're saying to you is also going to be impacted by the fact that you're in this particular environment or this outdoor setting. Indoor spaces will also influence the way we communicate and what we talk about. So an example of this would be funeral parlors, of course. Children, which really have no filter, will go into any space and run around and laugh and giggle. And yet many times they get scolded for doing that because this is a place where one is probably more serious. Usually you're a little quieter. Think of it like kind of like a library, which is kind of the same environment, which is sort of very, very quiet. And then finally, time of day. And again, I'm looking specifically how that impacts the physical dimension. So, in the middle of the night, a dimly lit street might be very threatening, whereas maybe that same street in the middle of the day with sun and people out is going to be not as threatening. You're going to see time of day show up in another slide. So just wanted to make sure that you understood that I'm very, very well aware that I've got time listed twice here. And then finally, the weather. So as we know, when it is over 100 degrees, people tend to get kind of cranky. They get cranky on the freeway, they get cranky in Starbucks. They're just cranky. So weather impacts how we communicate with each other and how we perceive the world around us. The second dimension then is what's called this physiological dimension, and this refers to your own personal body that you carry around. So body type would be certainly a big thing. If you're taller, if you're shorter, if you're heavier, if you're thinner, all of those things influence how people communicate with us and how we communicate with other people. This would also extend into differing abilities. So people who are in wheelchairs, for example, many times feel like people don't want to establish eye contact with them because they're uncomfortable for whatever reason. This is a common occurrence, apparently. It's been told to me a number of times. But this would be part of that physiological dimension, is do you communicate with someone differently if they're in a wheelchair or they're on crutches as opposed to if they are walking without that kind of assistance. The second physiological dimension that influences communication is age. So certainly the way you talk to your grandmother, your great-grandmother is going to be probably different than the way you talk to your younger brother or sister in terms of language, in terms of slang, in terms of the content. You might not use as much, profanity with, some senior in your family than you would, your own brother or sister. Clothing and artifacts are also a big factor in this, particularly in intercultural communication, where people have different traditions and different artifacts and different styles of clothing, and we communicate with them very differently. So, what you're wearing and what you're carrying with you will certainly influence how people communicate with you. Certainly someone who's wearing a Make America Great Again cap is going to be perceived a little differently than a person who's wearing a Black Lives Matter cap. Gender and sex, so sex being the biological part and gender being the identity or your choice. That will also influence, of course, how we communicate with people, how we perceive messages, how people perceive our own messages. And finally, your overall health. So, if someone is ill, if you've ever cared for someone who's very ill, your demeanor changes than your demeanor that you have with your friends. You're more tender, you're more quiet, you're more, nurturing with your friends. Maybe you're less likely to do that. The next dimension is what's called the psychological dimension, of course, deals with our psychology. You can't have a class about interpersonal or even intercultural communication without talking about psychology. So certainly our current emotional state influences very heavily how we perceive people around us, how we perceive messages around us, and we also communicate. The way we communicate is influenced on that particular emotional state. Also, any current values or beliefs. So just have a picture of Buddha here to kind of represent sort of a belief system or religion or philosophy. And then also the not that we believe in mimes, but the idea of the thumbs up, thumbs down, which kind of is supposed to cater to or be a reference for the attitudes that people have, that we like or we don't like something, and that will certainly impact when we go into a communication situation if we like or don't like something. If you know, for example, that there's a particular religion that you don't like, interacting with those people is going to be definitely impacted by your attitudes going into that kind of conversation. Finally, your own self-concept or your own self-esteem will impact how you communicate with other people and how they hear it. Certainly a person who is very confident in what they're saying, who might have a very strong self-concept or very high self-esteem, isn't going to use disclaimer words like, you're probably going to think this is silly, but, or I may be wrong, but, or I'm not sure if anybody else has felt this way, but they're simply going to say whatever it is they need to say. And that we see that in particular with gender communication, that the way men talk to other men and women talk to other women is many times very different than the way, again, women talk to men. And these are going to be broad generalizations, but that's certainly where we start with everything. The next dimension, second to the last, is what's called a social dimension. And this looks at a couple of different things. It looks first off at status. So, the way you communicate with each other in class is going to be differently than the way you communicate with me. By nature of the fact that I'm the instructor, and that seems to be kind of a barrier for many people. But in your household, if your father or mother is in charge and you're simply seen as, a child that is an adult child, then that's going to impact the kind of communication you have and the way you hear things. So parents many times at your age seems like they're nagging a lot. When you get a little bit older, all of a sudden it doesn't seem like they're nagging so much, but they have some really smart things to say, and that's all because of that impact of status. The second aspect of the dimension is how formal is this context? How casual is this context? The way people are dressed, again, the formality of the language, the formality of the event will influence the kind of communication we have, the quality of it, and how it actually gets expressed. So that's why I have the nice, happy 1950s couple in their cocktail party garb. All right. Also, what will influence this is how friendly or hostile we perceive a situation to be. If you're going into a friendly situation where everybody's pretty open and chill, then your guard is going to be down, your defenses won't be up. It'll be like I can share with people and it's going to be totally fine. But if you go into a situation that feels hostile, yeah, you're going to be a bit more guarded in what you say, and you might hear those comments as being more threatening than maybe they would have been in a friendly situation. And finally, how cooperative or competitive the situation is will also influence, again, how we communicate. So you notice I'm saying that each of these influences communication. This is what we've got to cover this whole semester. So in my, homage to the Olympics, which we did not have this summer, the idea of if this were a cooperative environment and you were friendly with everybody and knew that everybody had equal access to something, that's going to change things as opposed to if it were competitive. So in a competitive work environment, for example, people might not share so much. They might be not so willing to help each other out because it's kind of like it's a me against you kind of thing. And then finally, the last aspect is the temporal or time dimension. So there's that word time again. It comes up in a slightly different context, though. This is the last frame within the context. The first is time of day. So certainly if you're a morning person, that 8 o'clock class, you're just raring to go. And by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you're starting to drag. Alternately, if you're not a morning person, if you're up until 2 or 3 o'clock at night, that 8 o'clock class is a bit of a stretch, which means it will impact how you communicate. It will impact how you process what other people are saying around you. The second aspect is what's called the sequencing of a message, and this simply refers to the logical progression within a conversation. So if you're telling someone sad news or something that's really upsetting to you, you wouldn't expect for them to all of a sudden say, well, this is a good thing that happened to me. I mean, that would be kind of inappropriate. So that sequencing is a pattern that we expect to hear in any kind of communication situation. Finally, the timing is the last thing. And this kind of goes back to, early in the day kind of thing. When you get home after a long day at work or school, and one of your parents starts saying, well, you forgot to do this and you forgot to do this, and I told you to do this the other day and you haven't done it yet. That's not the right timing. It has nothing to do with sequencing, but that's just not the right time. It's maybe a right time for them to say it, but it's not a right time for you to hear it, which means it's not the right time. So this is really crucial, and we'll talk about this, especially when we talk about conflict. This is where it comes into play most frequently. So unfortunately, I can't take questions in class, but I will be in class, and you can ask me then. Just wanted to review that with each dimension within the context will influence communication. And again, there were 5 of them. There was the physical one, which deals with the concrete spaces that we have, not just concrete, but the actual physical environment. Then you've got both the psychological and the physiological elements or dimensions. You've got the social one, which is who are we to each other. And finally, the temporal or time one, which is time of day and also what is happening within the actual conversation, what follows what in that conversation.